Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and it's not worth really wasting time at the beginning of this video just to say that The Gathering Storm is peak. It is my first 5-star read of The Wheel of Time since 2 years ago when I read The Fires of Heaven, and I have virtually zero complaints about this personally. If you want to hear more of the specifics, feel free to continue watching, but you know, this video is just going to be a whole lot of just being excited about the book, basically. I'm not sure the actual quality of what this is going to be. I do recommend checking out the recommendation section of this video at least, because there are some peculiarities about trying to recommend a book this far into a series this massive between different portions of an audience, technically speaking, but, you know, we'll get to all of that in due time. The main thing about The Gathering Storm is that it is awesome, so let's just talk about the good of the book, because holy cow, there's a lot of good about this book. And the main thing is that it opens up spectacularly. You know, Robert Jordan has a history of having some pretty great prologues and also some pretty mediocre prologues, and more of his mediocre prologues are mediocre in my opinion because they don't really focus on the type of material that feels like prologue stuff compared to just main story setup stuff, and so things get a little bit messy at times. But the very first scene of The Gathering Storm, which I understand that the first scene of the prologue was written by Jordan, that maybe a lot of the rest of the prologue was also written by him, but I might have my information pretty wrong on that point. But if that, in either case, whoever wrote the first scene of the prologue just to set the tone and really basically build up the conceit of this final act of the story, the Gathering Storm, the last battle's approaching, first scene of the prologue immediately sets the tone incredibly, and then it just doesn't let up from that point. You know, it's really, really great. And when I speak about not letting up, that is one of this book's greatest strengths, in my opinion, is that the pace of the material is super on point the entire time, and that the decision to change how POV allocation goes in the series by this point in the series is actually a very good idea, both from the structural perspective, but also from, you know, general pacing perspective. Like I said, things are a little bit different here, in accordance with, well, the way that Robert Jordan has written all of the previous books in the series, is you tend to have several chapters, you know, anywhere from like 2 to 5 or sometimes even more, like 2 to 7 basically chapters that are all focused on one storyline, and sometimes even within that storyline a singular POV the entire time. And while that has generally worked for the most part, and definitely worked pretty well in the earlier books of the series where there were less storylines and less characters to focus on in the first place, there is a certain degree to which the last handful of books have been pretty hampered by this, because it meant that Robert Jordan just wasn't really getting to the point with certain scenes the way that he probably should have been. A lot of material within the last few books could have been consolidated, where certain reveals in particular scenes could have been made in different scenes and maybe even been made more effectively in those scenes, and therefore the scenes that they exist in don't actually need to exist at all. You have problems like with the Elaine plotline, for example, during the Slog arc, as I'm choosing to call it, basically books 7 through 11. There's a couple books there where Elaine's plotline takes a lot of words to do not very much, and a lot of that material could have definitely been consolidated to have a far more snappy and effective storyline on that front. The Gathering Storm is a lot stronger than previous books because it is not allowed to do that. The POVs switch pretty regularly through the vast majority of this book, where I think in the first half of the book there's not a single set of 2 chapters where the same POV is part of those 2 chapters, and even in the back half it's only a few times that this happens where it's just 2 or 3 chapters or something like that where it's the same POV. But even then it's not the same POV, it's just the same storyline for a few chapters in those cases, with like one exception throughout the entire book. So basically the point is you are flipping back and forth between different POVs the entire time. And you might be like, well, that's too drastic of a change for the series. But the thing is that by this point, you're in the last act of the series, things need to be starting to come together rather than doing all of their own separate things in different places. They need to be starting to come together at some point, and this is the point where they're starting to do that. And in the way that Brandon Sanderson chooses to structure the book and have the POV switches throughout, it actually really serves this purpose super, super well. I think that you end up with certain things that happen in certain orders that feel a little bit more impactful. And there are also times where you do follow the same storyline chapter after chapter for a few chapters, but the POV changes between the chapters mean that you're viewing some of those events from some different POVs. For example, in Rand's plotline here, there are some massive moments that occur from his perspective, but the immediate chapter afterwards or something like that is a different POV. So you get to see what he looks like from a different character's perspective, and you just get a lot more depth from Rand's character in particular here, just on account of the way that POVs are handled. So just in general, I think that the structure and the pacing of the book really works because of the way that POVs are handled here. And like I said as well, it also means that chapters, well, this isn't something that I said, it's more something that's very heavily implied, but it's the other thing that makes The Gathering Storm so great, and what allows it to be so great is that it can't waste time. You know, my criticism of the last handful of books is that I don't think they're bad books, but a lot of them do waste a lot of time in certain areas. The first 6 chapters or something of Winter's Heart are basically pointless and could have been made one chapter at the end of Path of Daggers instead, and nothing of value would have been lost. And you also even have Knife of Dreams, which the back half of that book is great. The prologue and first couple chapters of it are great, but most of the first half of that book basically didn't need to exist because it was doing the same thing that those plot lines were doing in Crossroads of Twilight, and you know, the setup that it was doing for the back half of the book didn't need to take more than a chapter a piece, for example. So you have a lot of structural and pacing issues in those books on account of the way that they're structured, but the added bonus of having the POVs switch pretty frequently here and switching the storyline pretty frequently as well is not just allowing things to come together, but also every chapter has to serve a purpose inherently. You don't have the opportunity for 4 or 5 chapters with a particular POV where some degree of that content was basically unnecessary and could have been cut for efficiency's sake, and not just efficiency's sake, just straight up for the sake of the book being better. But, you know, those are different arguments for a different day. The Gathering Storm is not allowed to waste any of that time. If there is a chapter in here from a particular POV, there is a reason for that chapter to exist, both in what it's doing and for the POV chosen to do that. So all of these things are kind of connected together. The POV allocation, the way that those switch, the pacing and the structure of a lot of the storylines and everything, all of it just really comes together in this book in a very surprising way, because I was a little bit dubious going into this book, like, what is this actually going to do for the series with Brandon Sanderson, for example, writing with this constant POV switches compared to Jordan's style of tending to hang with a particular character for a substantial amount of time, even 100 or more pages at a time before moving on to the next. And the truth is that it allows the plot to actually move forward and for the whole story to be more smooth this time around. Speaking of smooth, Sanderson's prose is also much smoother for me to read at this point, where I like Robert Jordan's prose as a whole, particularly early on in the series. Even later in the series, I don't despise it. It's more the efficiency of what he's actually saying with it that gets a little bit tedious rather than bad per se. Where if he had an editor's hand in the last few books, I still wouldn't really complain about his prose very much. I think that the people who complain about his prose as early as, like, The Shadow Rising, I think are particularly sensitive to this, but it took until Lord of Chaos before I noticed prose bloat starting to become a thing. But, you know, following the slog arc, where you have 5 books that realistically could have just been 3 books, things really needed to move here, and that definitely happens. Sanderson's prose absolutely moves in The Gathering Storm. But overall, those are some relatively more technical aspects of what makes this book so good, in my opinion. Some more of the content related things is that I think that The Gathering Storm actually works both really well as its own book and also as one half of what is pretty clearly a solid consolidation act here, where Gathering Storm and Towers of Midnight are doing things together concurrently to basically bring the entire series and all of the plot lines, all the major characters together to be ready for A Memory of Light. And I think that The Gathering Storm, in its focuses on this front, are actually really good. You know, you do have a little bit of stuff going on with characters like Matt getting fully out of Shan-Chan territory and basically back to Camelin. You have a few chapters of his plot line in here. You also have a couple chapters of Perrin's subplot bullcrap stuff that has been working for many books at this point. Fully taking him out of that and actually making him ready to move forward also works here, where you can tell that both of these storylines are going to be pretty major parts of Towers of Midnight. And I think that that worked as far as it needed to in here. Just to make sure that we still were acknowledging and using those plot lines, even if they weren't actually doing anything in here quite yet, with the only real exception of the major storylines that doesn't appear in The Gathering Storm being Elaine's plotline. But I think that that's fine, because we can do stuff with her in Towers of Midnight, and quite frankly, her arc was very well and truly closed. Like, it was very cleanly cut off at the end of A Knife of Dreams in a way that's like, yeah, you didn't need to include it in here. It wasn't included in here, so we're good. And so those are like some of the background main storylines in here, but you also have a lot of other stuff going on. You know, you have a couple of side characters that have some of their own POVs and some stuff going on with them that are interesting. You get to see a little bit more of Tuon, specifically from her own POV now that she's split from Matt. That's really interesting in here. And you have the same thing with Avienda, who's kind of doing a little bit of her own stuff, but you can tell that that's going to be set up and utilized probably more in Towers of Midnight, with the timing stuff to be ready for A Memory of Light, and that's going to be pretty interesting to see. But the main thing, the main soul and spirit of The Gathering Storm, comes down to two particular storylines, and those are Rand's storyline, which I already mentioned a couple times briefly in some respects, as well as Egwene's storyline, or rather the White Tower plotline, broadly speaking. Now, the main thing that I have to give Gathering Storm credit for as far as Rand's storyline goes is actually making me excited for Rand's storyline. I have not been this invested in his arc and what's been going on with him since A Crown of Swords, basically, you know, ever since the end of book 6, that since Dumai's Wells, I've been kind of hit or miss in as far as my investment with Rand's plotline, where he's kind of been a background character throughout the slog arc, which it's just kind of funny, because a lot of the weird thing about book 7 through 11 is that Rand doesn't actually take up a lot of words in basically any of those books, because he's just kind of present throughout the entire thing. He's the main character, it makes sense, but you have the other major characters which take up way bigger portions of time in every one of those books for various different reasons. And so I just never really felt like I was with Rand basically at all for the last handful of books, and he's never been my favorite character in the series, but The Gathering Storm brings him back into a much bigger main character focus, and also makes me invested and excited in him as a character and in his plotline in ways that I haven't been in forever. I haven't been this excited about his plotline since Fires of Heaven, I would say, pretty easily. But now that I am fully on board with him, since his character is actually forced to confront a lot of stuff in this book, and his arc within this individual book is super satisfying. People talk about how, Rand changes a lot throughout the series, and I don't think that that's actually super true. He has an arc of acceptance in the first few books, and then he has an arc of growth within his new role within the next few books, but then books 7 through 11, he doesn't really change all that much. He makes certain big decisions, but he as a person and as a character doesn't really change. It is this book where you start to actually see the way that he has changed and the effect that has actually had on him. things that have been drawn out for several books feel like they're actually coming together here. And then he has a full entire character arc within this one book rather than over the course of several books. So, that's a lot of why I feel more invested with Rand now after The Gathering Storm than I was before, and has me really interested to see how his character handles what happens at the end of this book, in A Memory of Light, because I don't anticipate him being in Towers of Midnight very much, if at all, basically. But, so there's all of that. I am fully on board with Rand's plotline now. He finally has some of these crazy awesome developments, like I said, and most importantly, many of the most gripping and intense moments of the entire series are within this book, within Rand's plotline. So that is also something that is definitely worth noting. But the other major storyline is the other thing that I definitely want to praise a lot here, and that is Egwene's story. That is the White Tower plotline, going all the way back to like book 5, basically. Ever since the Saladar plotline, to be honest, I've been invested in the politics of the White Tower and the split and everything that's been going on with that for a very, very long time. It's been one of my favorite parts of the series, but especially since coming to siege the White Tower. Ever since Egwene's group coming to siege the White Tower, from that point all the way through this book, easily my favorite plotline of the entire series. Like, I think that I'm willing to go on record saying that it is just incredible. Definitely one of the most memorable sequences of the series, because when the politics of the Wheel of Time are great, they are stupendous, and the way that the politics are handled with the White Tower plotline, I think, are genuinely really, really interesting and really cool. I just really enjoyed all of that material. So all of that work of building up and changing the dynamics of different things, and just there's so many things that are going on in the background politically, all the way from, like I said, even as far back as Fires of Heaven, because of the Saladar plotline starting. But we'll say, for the purposes of like this discussion, from like books 8 through 11 have a lot of setup for this, and then this book starts to actually pay off a lot of that. All of the work, especially done at the end of Crossroads of Twilight and through Knife of Dreams for Egwene specifically, with regard to her role within the White Tower, it all just pays off super, super brilliantly in this book. It's just incredible. I cannot speak highly enough about the White Tower plotline here. I know that there are some people who don't really like Egwene, who don't really like the White Tower stuff, but definitely been the thing that I've loved so much about these last few books. One of the things that has made Crossroads of Twilight and Knife of Dreams bearable for me, even in spite of some of the things that make them unbearable, has been the White Tower plotline. And the White Tower plotline being more or less absent in some of those books, I realize is no small part of what I don't like about some of them. Like Winter's Heart, as far as I recall, I don't think has any of this plotline in it, and Winter's Heart is my least favorite book of the series, and I think that no White Tower plotline is no small part of that. Actually, let me go ahead and double check that, make sure that I'm not just completely lying out my butthole, because it would be embarrassing if I said that that was why Winter's Heart was one of my least favorite books in the series, and it turned out that there was a ton of that stuff in it. So I'm just going to double check real quick, and no, I was exactly right. There's no Egwene POV in Winter's Heart, so I was correct. Yeah, so that actually explains a lot, to be honest. But yeah, so just a lot of really great stuff. The way that Sanderson is able to handle all the major plot lines with regard to the places that they start, following the previous book's climax, and where they actually need to be here. It's all handled incredibly well. There's also another thing that I haven't really mentioned up to this point. There's also a degree to which all of the major plot lines of this book have a dynamic with the primary antagonists of the previous arc of the series that leave, quite frankly, this last arc of the series in a big place of potential, and that potential could go any direction, good or ill or whatever. But the previous arc has been very heavily focused on the Shan-Chan. And knowing and understanding where all of the major characters, the main characters of The Gathering Storm are in accordance to the Shan-Chan is also a super interesting thing that I think leaves a lot of possibility open for the next couple of books. I mean, between Rand and the White Tower and Matt and then even Perrin a little bit here, because Elaine's storyline, I'm pretty sure, has had nothing to do with the Seanchan up to this point, or basically nothing to do with it for all intents and purposes over the last few books. So, her story not being in the Gathering Storm from that particular angle also makes a little bit of sense. But you see where certain relationship dynamics and political dynamics between the Seanchan and all of these four major characters, Rand, Egwene / the White Tower, broadly speaking, Mat, and Perrin, they are all in very different places between these major characters. And considering that these major characters are all basically on the same team, but there's also a lot of technicalities with regard to all of that, that's really cool. It's one of the strengths of the series overall. But yeah, just seeing where the Seanchan are with regard to all of the main characters is like, how in the world is this going to develop and settle for the last battle? Because that's one of the main things that this book is trying to tackle, is like, we need to like let bygones be bygones, and we need to get ready for the last battle. And there are some degrees to which there are significant efforts and even steps made to have this work, but there's also a lot of places where it's not working at all. And it's all just really, really cool stuff. Yeah, so that's a lot of really great things about The Gathering Storm, but believe it or not, there is one last thing that I do want to talk about, and that is that I must really highly commend the end of this book, the general climax of it, especially with regard to Rand's and Egwene's plot lines. Rand has a sort of like double hitter of climaxes for him as well, where there's like a couple of things that happen back to back that are like absolutely massive and have huge ramifications on the world and on the competition and on him, that are really, really engaging and just awesome. You get to see him be like legitimately scary person in a way that he's only like explained as sort of implicitly being scary in previous books, but where he's like kind of not actually. But in this book, he does get pretty scary at a couple points, and that's really cool. But then he also has like a very personal moment at the very end of the book that is like huge ramifications for his character moving forward, not just as a reflection of this book, but doing that and also taking it and making very clear how he's going to be different even in the next couple of books. Is like, okay, yeah, I can finally see why people are praising Rand's character arc over the course of the series. Most of that is actually happening in this book, and I can see pretty clearly is going to be over the next couple books as well. And that's all really cool stuff. But then as far as like plot climax related things, the White Tower has a huge climactic resolution after these several books of buildup that I've explained about, and that makes the last, I don't know, 100-ish pages of this book just absolutely mind-bogglingly incredible. Like, it's just so good. It is so worth experiencing these moments blind. It's just, it's great. It is so good. Alas, however, I can't just do all this praising of The Gathering Storm and not say that there are a couple of minor things about the book that are going to bother some people, whether or not they actually bothered me. You know, I don't personally have much to complain about the book. I think that this is basically peak Wheel of Time, and a lot of the reason why it's able to be peak Wheel of Time is because it is as good as previous Wheel of Time. Like, that's one of the positive things that I should have said, is that Brandon Sanderson just inherently understands this world and these characters to a degree that is genuinely incredible. But that means that there are a couple of things about the book that do get on some people's nerves. You know, the bad of The Gathering Storm is that there are a couple exceptions to this. You know, there is a particular scene in Rand's plotline, you know, that deals with Semirhage. I'm not going to say any more. That is pretty silly, all things considered. And I understand why people have a big issue with this, because it is silly. It is kind of stupid in some regard as well, and was a scene that Brandon Sanderson himself did not enjoy writing, and also was only included on Robert Jordan's insistence. Like, his outline was pretty insistent that this scene had to happen, and I'm not entirely sure that it had to happen that way, even though I do think that it actually kind of works for what it is, all things considered. So it didn't personally super bother me. But there is that particular scene that does bother some people a good bit, And I totally see why. And then there's also the fact that people complain about the way that Matt is handled in this book. There's not a whole ton of Matt POV in The Gathering Storm. He only has a few chapters. But people were just like, Sanderson didn't really nail Matt's his attitude and just his general character in this book. And I halfway disagree. Like, I see why people make a focus on it, because it is like the only character, like Matt and then Talmanes as well within Matt's plot line. These two characters are like the only people that Brandon Sanderson does not write so brilliantly in this book that you cannot tell that it's a different author. So that means that they stick out a little bit. But I also don't think that they're as bothersome as people make them out to be. It's just the fact that you can tell that they're a little bit different here than the last couple of books that people make a big stink over, just like, he totally messed up he did not mess up Matt's character. It's, I think that criticism is overblown, but it is something that does bother some people. But really, The Gathering Storm does benefit from the fact, for me, that even these complaints of the book amongst other people don't bother me enough to really make that much of a stink about it. I just really don't. I only bring them up because other people talk about them so much. And then there's the fact that the general Jordanisms that I have had complaints about for the last several books, things like prose bloat and scenes that just don't really do a whole lot to actually serve the novel, they don't exist because Jordan didn't write this book. So, like I said, there's not really that much bad to talk about with The Gathering Storm. But there is one complaint, I guess, that I have. And it's not that much of a complaint, so we're going to take this into the ugly. And that is because this series has focused is not the right word. The series has had a problem at various different points with regard to timeline and understanding when exactly certain things are happening in accordance to others. There are a lot of times where it doesn't really matter that much. And there are other times where it does, and like things do get centralized a little bit. Things like Crossroads of Twilight does a very good job of more or less centralizing all of the major storylines in reaction to a massive event that happens at the end of book 9, and so starts to build that up towards the last act of the series, basically. Unfortunately, The Gathering Storm does start to see some of this get messed up a little bit. It's not awful, and I'm willing to overlook all of it because, quite frankly, this is something that I talked about before. The Gathering Storm and Towers of Midnight especially are books that very much need to see everything, all of the things of the series, start to come together so that A Memory of Light can happen as one big epic finale, as opposed to a finale of various different things just happening, right? So there's a good bit of consolidation that means these two books need to come together. And when you have as much material as there is in this series by the end of the slog arc, this is a lot of why the slog arc is the slog arc, is because Jordan just does not do a very good job handling and balancing all of the storylines and all of the major POVs in accordance with one another. Brandon Sanderson has to basically fix that issue and bring it all together, but there's so much material that ends up being too long. So The Gathering Storm and Towers of Midnight pretty obviously do a lot of this work, but that means that they were implicitly kind of meant to be like one book. But they're also way too long to just be one book, so they had to not be one book. As such, there are plot lines, there are stories that happen between these two books, and I haven't read Towers of Midnight yet, but I can see pretty clearly how this is the case, that there just had to be splits made to make them individual books. And in the case of The Gathering Storm, with regard to the major stories, those being Rand's and Egwene's, absolutely brilliantly handled. There are a couple of other storylines in there, like Matt's and Perrin's and stuff. And then the fact that Elaine's isn't really in here at all means that these storylines are basically going to have to be what fills up the bulk of Towers of Midnight, so that you can get all of these plot lines basically at the same place at the end of The Gathering Storm does, so that they are ready to actually come together, do the last battle, and be done and over with, right? However, there is a pretty important moment that does occur in Rand's plotline, specifically near the end of The Gathering Storm, that implies some story that occurs here. Like if you're going through the entire book, like from the beginning going on, and then there's this moment here, and then there's the end over here, there's a little gap that happens in there where there's some story that does not occur in The Gathering Storm that I'm 99% certain will occur in in Towers of Midnight. And just in general, that means that there are going to be some storyline things that happen in Towers of Midnight that might get a little bit funky and goofy with regard to The Gathering Storm. Like I said, the things being split for The Gathering Storm and Towers of Midnight because of just how long these books are, out of necessity, is something that is probably worth noting. There's a couple things that you're going to notice while reading, just like, wait a minute, there's some very important stuff that did not happen in this book, and then I anticipate that I'm going to end up reading it in the next book, and that's going to be some weird, maybe whiplash-inducing stuff. But as far as all of that is concerned, the reason that this is in the ugly is because it's, returning to the timeline problems that the series has had in the past. But this time around, I am genuinely super willing to overlook it. Like, I'm willing to forgive it. I'm willing to not make any big deal about it overall, because this book is so good with all the stuff that is here that the fact that there's a couple things that are just like, wait a minute, there's something that probably should have happened here that didn't, it's fine. I don't care. It doesn't bother me enough to do anything about, because if those moments were in this book, the pacing of this book might have been pretty significantly affected in a negative way in the final act, and that would not have been worth it. So maybe seeing some of that stuff happen in Towers of Midnight, perfectly fine. Like I said, I'm willing to forgive it for now. We'll see how I feel about it after I've read Towers of Midnight, when I review that book a little bit later this month. But overall, it's one of those ugly things that's like, you're probably going to notice some weirdness here. I definitely noticed some weirdness here, and I haven't even read Towers of Midnight yet. I've only read the prologue at the time of recording this video. But just as I've said like a million times in this section already, I'm willing to forgive it. I'm willing to overlook it. It doesn't bother me enough to make a big deal out of it, because you can tell that it was made out of necessity, that, there wasn't really another option. You can't combine these two books to be one book, because then they would be like 630,000 words long, and that is too long to make an individual book. So out of just what the series had to do, it is something that I would ordinarily complain about, but I'm not for this time, so that is that. But I've been rambling for way too long. I'm very sorry about this. I was thinking this video would be less than a half hour, but my recording is a half hour long already, and we are just now getting into the recommendation. So let me try to make this as short and sweet and relatively simple as possible. With regard to The Gathering Storm, people who say that Knife of Dreams is a return to form for The Wheel of Time aren't necessarily wrong, but I do think it is a little bit of a stretch, and I've mentioned that at multiple points over the last few months. But I think that people who say that The Gathering Storm instead is the true return to form of the series, I am one of these people. I think these people are objectively correct, because it is the return to form for the series. It's not just the most excited I've been about the series since Fires of Heaven. It's not just my first 5-star read of The Wheel of Time since Fires of Heaven. It is also the fact that it reminds me, in terms of the way that different characters are focused on and the epic moments. Just a lot of what this book is doing actively reminds me of those first handful of books of the series that I loved so much, as opposed to the next handful of books, which, had things that I really like, but overall just aren't really doing what I want the series to do. This returns to doing what I want the series to do, and I think that that is a really important point. And as such, I do think it is really worth reading, but there are obviously some asterisks, whatever, however you pronounce that word, with regard to the actual recommendation. I think that there are a few different categories of people who are going to need to approach the series a little bit differently when it comes to getting to this book, right? I think that if you are struggling through the slog and just need a little bit of motivation, like you're not hating it, but you don't really feel super driven to read the books, I concur with everybody else and think that it is absolutely worth pushing through if you're enjoying the series broad scale, but you just don't know how efficient you need to be with the slog or whatever, I think that you should just push through so that you can get to the Gathering Storm, because it is absolutely worth it. Or rather, it is basically worth it. Basically worth it because on its own as a book, it is incredible, as long as you are not loathing the series to begin with. If the slog is fine / tolerable to you individually, consider this your motivation to push through it so that you can get to this book, because it is as good as people say it is. If, however, the slog is miserable and intolerable to you, I think it is worth getting to this book by just reading the wiki chapter summaries if you have to. Like, if you are absolutely just really struggling with the slog, but you do like the series, you did love the early series, you just want to get to the end, you just want it to be good again, if you have to read wiki chapter summaries to get through a couple of those books there in the middle, I don't blame you. Just do it so that you can get to this book. It's worth it, and I don't think that you need to read every single word in those previous books to get everything that they are doing. I just really don't. So that is like my basic recommendation. I would say, as like a little technicality, I do recommend at least reading the back half of Knife of Dreams in full, not just as chapter summaries, but you know, you do whatever you feel like you need to do. If you've like stalled out basically at book 9 or 10 or something like that, just read wiki chapter summaries to get through the end of book 11, and then just start reading this book from the beginning, and you will have the information that you need to enjoy it, and you'll be able to enjoy this book a lot more because, again, it is actually good. So there's that. I do not, however, recommend the approach that Read by Kyle has unironically suggested to people, and the approach that I'm pretty sure he made, which was skipping books 7 through 11 entirely. He might have even skipped book 6. He might have gone straight from Fires of Heaven to Gathering Storm. Whatever it was that he did there, and whatever it was he has unironically, I've seen this. I've seen evidence of this in like Discord of like legitimately recommending for some people to do that. Do not do that. I think that is a stupid idea. And I don't care who you are. It doesn't matter to me. Don't do that. It's stupid. It is genuinely ridiculous to suggest that you can skip all of those books. Could you make books 7 through 11 from those 5 books and take them down to just 3 books? Yes, absolutely. I'm one of the main people who's going to tell you that is absolutely true. Can you skip those 5 books entirely, even without reading summaries? Because again, Read by Kyle has suggested that to people. No. Wrong, incorrect. It is just an utterly inane and insane idea to think that you could do that. That said, I also think that if you hate books 4 through 6, like if you just are absolutely miserable already with the series 4 through 6, don't even take that approach of reading chapter summaries just to get to this point or anything like that. The series isn't going to be worth it for you, just as a rule. It's just not going to be worth it for you. So if you are that far in the series, if you are in the second trilogy and you are miserable, wondering if it's worth pushing through, it's not. So just don't do it. And don't do the stupid, silly, skip 5 entire books of the series, don't even bother with summaries, and just skip to book 12. Like, no, absolutely not. I think it's just stupid. But anyway, that is going to be the end of this very long review. I apologize for it being so long, but that is the way things go sometimes. And as a little final note, this is the first and only time that I'm reviewing one of these Wheel of Time books after I have already started the next one. I don't know if that's 100% true, but I do know it's the only time that a review is going to come out after the diaries for the next book have already started coming out. And that is because of doing back-to-back diaries every week for these last few months to get through the rest of the series and other general video scheduling stuff on the channel. So sorry about the weirdness of the timing a little bit of that, but it won't happen again. On that note, I am currently reading Towers of Midnight. I did mention earlier in this review that I've read the prologue of it so far at the time of this video's recording, at the time of it being posted. Obviously, I've obviously at least read through like chapter 15 or something for the first diary, and I've probably even read further than that. So if you want to see my first impressions, my spoiler-free first impressions of Towers of Midnight, you can already do that on the channel, and over the last few Thursdays of March, I will be continuing to go through that book, doing those diaries, talking about the book, and then on the 31st of March, 2 days before I start releasing diaries for A Memory of Light, will be my review for Towers of Midnight to correspond. So you'll have 2 Wheel of Time reviews this month. How exciting. I will be finished with the series in April, and I'm very excited to be done with it, but I'm also very excited to just see what these next 2 books have to offer, because I think this one was great, and I think that the next 2 will probably be great as well. That being said, I will not be 100% done making Wheel of Time diary content in April, but I'll talk a little bit more about that next month. Thank you for watching this video. If you did, again, I utterly apologize for just how long this is. It's actually going to throw a wrench into my scheduling for things at the time that I'm recording this, but that is the way things go sometimes. But I do appreciate you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.